Hey guys, welcome to the MC Anime Podcast. We cover anime, geek culture, Japanese aesthetics, and Asian studies. We are a multi-fandom podcast, and you can expect to hear topics in your favorite hobby or fandom activity potentially. You can find MC Anime on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Also, please check out mcanimepodcast.com, our website. Furthermore, stay tuned in for another episode.
Guys, this is MC from MC Anime Podcast. We're here with another episode, and Crystal's back with us today. Say hi and see what about yourself.
Hello, everyone. The local owl puppy is here, or the local artist specifically.
So, where can they find you? What you do, real quick, and then we get into the topic.
You can find me on Twitter, which is Shapeshift16, and I'm also recently obtained a Tumblr, but I don't know that one's username off the top of my head.
Gotcha. So, further ado, today's episode is going to be Asian Studies, Eastern versus Western storytelling. And we're going to discuss elements of how Eastern civilizations tell their stories and how, over the years, Western civilizations have told their stories through storytelling. So we're going to bring up some good examples of each one to give a slight comparison. And then we're going to go into details surrounding the literature, the civilization, how they differentiate, and stuff like that. It's going to be a comparative analysis. So, what do you think about the storytelling in today's episode?
Before you told me about this topic, I honestly didn't think there were that many differences between the two. I thought it was simple. I didn't think there were going to be that many differences until I actually did some research. Aside from the often stated that the Eastern stories oftentimes can have conflicts that are forced on characters. Sometimes that's just not fun.
Yeah, that still happens from time to time.
Except I've learned as of recently that apparently even Western stories can have plot points that can be forced on the characters and sometimes don't even look that fun.
Yeah, and the storytelling with that's kind of interesting in the Western side. So let's jump into it. There's just different elements of the storytelling conventions in Western civilization. You have the American side, then you have the European side, which we know more about. Americans got their own style. So,
that's probably because most Americans came from Europe. So they would have taken the storytelling techniques from Europe over to America.
True, but America's also unique because it had its own spin on literature throughout the years.
Theory I have is that it could have possibly been inspired by the native people that lived in America. Even if we don't have them documented, they probably have some pretty good stories under their arsenal.
That's an element, but most of the time they took romanticized genre, turned it into fantasy, and then over time we got even more genres like science fiction, steampunk, and a different transition in each time period. Gothic era, all that stuff.
Quite impressive how many genres a story can fit under these days. I didn't think most of those would have existed.
Well, back then, like the 1800s, 1600s, a lot of the stories from Europe and America at the time were one style of genre. So the author only specialized in one genre. Very few times did they go out of their comfort zone. So the story conventions were pretty simple but effective in you have it. Like, for example, the American side was always a happy ending.
That's important. It's almost rare for something in America, at least early stories, to have either an ending with no conclusion or an ending that goes bad for everyone. There's always got to be happy ending for the main character or the author of the story.
And actually, a modern twist in American culture is this Disneyization effect of fairy tales, bringing it back and totally changing to fit a new audience.
Like how, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. The first one that seems to be coming to my head is The Little Mermaid, with how they altered that one story.
Well, that was live action, but they also had like different interpretations of the Grimm fairy tale, which was the original fairy tale, and they put a happy ending twist on it.
And that was to appeal to Western audiences as well as what could have been the target audience, which at the time were a family film. So it needs to appeal to kids as well as adults.
A lot of people don't look at the Grimm fairy tales were classic literature of Western civilization. They were classic.
Didn't they come from Germany?
Some did, but it also came up from Europe too. These are tales like Red Riding Hood, Three Little Pigs, Miss Muffet. They're pretty darker than what American literature was putting out at the time.
I remember a TV show I watched talked about that regarding the fairy tales. They actually were focusing on them and actually trying to touch on the original fairy tales, not the ones that have been altered by America.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Pinocchio's creepy. If you look at the backstory and him, just that type of style. That's how they did it. They had works that went into public domain so that they could put their own trademark on that version of that story and totally change it to how they see fit.
And that's
Unfortunately, that's kind of how society is now doing stuff. They're taking an older stories and adapting it into a new story.
They're missing what made the old story so memorable and so memorable. They're forgetting that part.
And another element of Western civilization you have to keep in mind is the old genre of romanticized fiction. The star-crossed lovers, the romance, how it actually plays up to the plot.
Because I can recall I can recall Firework, but that's specifically a romantic film from Japan. But that was specifically supposed to be romantic. Anything outside of that, I could vaguely remember if there was any, intense romantic angles in some anime. It's not the main focus.
So, a perfect example of romanticized literature with Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, I read that in the 9th grade. I was a nursemaid.
Because when you think about romantic literature, is 6 primary characteristics: the celebration of nature, focus on the individual and spirituality, celebration of isolation and melancholy, interest in the common man, idolization of women, and the personification in pathetic fallacy.
All of those within Romeo and Juliet, but I also saw those in episodes of Eastern cartoons that were inspired by the Shakespeare story. And all of them don't do it well, but there's one that is always pretty great according to its fan base.
Idolization of women was Juliet in some aspect, but then what also Romeo and Juliet is the star-crossed lovers motif. So a lot of romanticized fiction and Western civilization uses an archetypes. So Western civilization uses a lot of archetypes in their storytelling. And those archetypes usually come from the hero's ability. But let's talk about the melancholy and the isolation for them. In Romeo and Juliet itself, they play onto the tragedy comedy that is so known for the tragedy genre.
And so I have something to compare to that Romeo and Juliet angle. I'm going to talk about I'll talk about the My Little Pony episode that was inspired by the tale. It does something similar by showing how the two characters presented, how the relationship affected them over the course of years. Which is unlike Romeo and Juliet, the relationship took place over the course of several years instead of several months.
Yeah, because the melancholy and isolation where the two families couldn't be together, and then the melancholy, the tragic, is usually the ending of tragedy, how that happens.
Although unlike Romeo and Juliet, the fate of the two lovers at the end of the episode is left up to interpretation. Unlike Romeo and Juliet, it's not made clear what happened to them.
True.
So
and also,
they are deceased.
Yeah, true. And they focus on the individual. So them as the individual, they want to tell Juliet's story, Romeo's story, how them two trying to be together despite the obstacle. And Romeo is like the common man in the story too, if you think about it. He's the average Joe trying to get the woman he wants, period.
And Juliet.
So you can relate to him. You can relate to Romeo as the common man because of the fact that you know what they're coming from. And romanticized is really easy to relate to, so that's why it's so easy to tell it as a technique of storytelling.
Because that's something that everyone inevitably has to go through. They have to go through the experience of finding that special someone and realizing you like them to the point that you want to spend the rest of your life with that person.
And even if Western civilization didn't use romanticization literature, they definitely used romanticized obstacles. They used love as an obstacle sometimes. So when you look at that lens, not every story is is in that literature, but sometimes they just use it as a plot device. Because love is the plot device in most stories.
I always like stories that I often do like conflicts where the conflict is caused by a friendship most likely. Like someone turns aside and it's the remaining friendship between the two friends that's keeping them from actually wanting to finish the job, so to say.
True, that is something that can happen. And a different version of the endings of stories in Europe versus America is the happy ending is the gray/violet ending with the moral lesson at the end taught to you. So you can have a very gray or a violet ending, but then you get a lesson that's taught to you at the end.
They do say the best way to teach someone a lesson is to bash it over your head with it.
Yep.
You got.
Well, they don't necessarily bash it in your head, and they kind of
the best way
give
to
it
teach
to you
is the hard way.
Yeah, they
The
give
hard
it to
way
you.
usually
Wait,
lasts longer.
it's not really a happy ending most of the time in Europe. That's why Shakespeare likes the tragedy genre so much.
No wonder most of his tales end in tragedy.
Yes, it was very common to have that nitty gritty ending.
And yet we Americans, we don't seem to find that enjoyable at all. We like having a solid conclusion. Even I'll have thousands of questions from something if it doesn't have a concrete ending.
Well, but the thing is, Eastern civilization can have any ending under the sun. That's the thing with that. So that brings a good topic of the story convention in Eastern civilization. Typically, it's a reflection of life or the interconnected. Everything's interconnected.
I say one of the research reports I found regarding Eastern is that the plot isn't forced on the characters in Eastern stories or animes. It technically happens all around them. There's no direct antagonist in most stories. It's often just an issue between the two. The conflict is no story.
We'll get to that. Basically, there's the reflection of life lens of interconnectedness, and where it's basically things are where they are or they'll change. So there are chain events that happen as a story. That's how it's gonna happen. Cause and effect a lot of times.
I don't want that cause and effect angle.
True. Lovers are less likely to be together. They try to be together, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be together. They try it, but sometimes it doesn't happen that way.
And why I never got into romance.
Yeah, it did a lot of times too. Oh, here's a big one. Characters can be ended in mid-series, just like that. So a lot of times in literature of Eastern civilization, sometimes your favorite character will be gone out of the story, either killed off or taken out of the story completely.
I can think of a recent example of that.
What?
Go into spoilers for the anime if I were to say it.
Sure, go ahead.
If I must. It was for Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush. No shock there. During the fifth arc, they introduced a concept new to them, but not new to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise, of carding people. This was a temporary death that occurred over the course of the arc until it was reversed back.
Okay, so they carded people, and that's how they got them out. Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
And endings are not so happy in Eastern civilization. It can be any ending under the sun. It can be sad, it can be cliffhanger. It could be the self-sacrifice. So you might have a death in the ending to finalize everything. So it just depends on how it ends and how they want to tell the story.
Strangely, the opposite occurred. If you don't mind me doing a quick tangent that's connected to that point of view. That would actually, I'm shocked to hear that when I know the GX dub gave them that same kind of ending for the dub season 3. They didn't do the final episode of season 3. They just ended the series on a kind of out of nowhere cliffhanger.
Sometimes serialization of animated shows do that because they don't really do any more with books.
Or they want to do the next series.
True. So we're going to do a little bit with story structure. We only did the story conventions. Now we're going to do story structure. We're going to do the hero's journey, and then we're going to do Kishotenketsu, which is the Eastern civilization story structure. Yeah.
Alrighty, let her rip.
So the hero's journey. So typically in the West, we have a superhero. They overcome obstacles, and as a result, can do things like have help from the divine to intervene into a group of friends, or we call it the band of friends. They complete the quest. Distraction by villain. They're disgraced by the villain. They have to overcome the disgrace, and typically it's good with speed. So that's the hero's journey in a nutshell. There's a lot more but archetypes in the hero's journey that can come along the way, but typically the story structure is a single character. It's usually that focus of that character. And then you have some flashbacks on their group of friends.
Several cartoons flashed in my head with that description.
Well, it's also a lot of times first-person point of view. We get the point of view through the lens of the hero. So the story is told through the lens of the hero. Or sometimes you have a narrator.
That help. Narrators usually do help.
Kind of interesting because the biggest example of the hero's journey was the epic poem, the Odyssey. Homer, he attributed that collection of work as one of the extent of modern society still using that as a lens for studying literature.
I mean, I had to study it in high school.
It's similar to like the Iliad, which is also another poem, but it follows the Greek hero Odysseus. So what do you think of Odysseus in the Odyssey?
I mean, from what I can remember from it, which that was in high school, I didn't find the story that bad. The mention of the mythical creatures that Odysseus had to go up against or counter was interesting. Although, strangely, if my memory is correct, doesn't that also end in tragedy?
Yeah, kind of. So Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, and his journey coming home from the Trojan War. And anyone that doesn't know, the Trojan War was the Troy people fighting against all the other people trying to invade Troy. The reason why the fortification of Troy was such formidable, the walls around the city protected it, but they had a diversion to get into the cities to give it expression. But that's a tangent I don't need to get into. After the war, which lasted 10 years, his journey from Troy to Ithaca, from Africa and Southern Europe, lasted for 10 additional years, in which he had many kills and all the crewmates killed. In his absence, Odysseus was soon dead, and then Penelope and her son Harmonious had to continue with a group of unruly citizens. They were all competing for Penelope's hand in marriage. So you have a displaced hero, here's the king, assumed dead, and now his children of Ithaca have to find suitors in his absence for someone to rule.
That was the time period, after all.
True. A lot of times when the Odyssey would, in the Homeric Greek, this was a oral tradition. So Homer's authorship of the poem was not questioned, but contemporary scholarship predominantly assumes that the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed differently in the stories for the oral tradition.
Kind of like us sharing ghost stories around a campfire. Not the same kind of storytelling, but it was spread in a similar manner, and also written down.
A lot of times during this time period, the only way to tell stories was to just vocally say it. So that's how we have now later translations of that story, is that someone wrote it down to take reference.
And thankfully, it has survived for so long. There's so many stories from those time periods that have been lost to history for whatever reason.
Well, it's kind of interesting because we have like guest friendship, we have the returning, testing and Olin. So this really does like pave the way for the hero's journey. We have certain groups like women, slavery, nation. This is also remarkable. The exports of kings during the Trojan War. The Odyssey is one of the most significant works of the Western canon. First translation of the Odyssey was in the 16th century. Adaptations and reimaginings are always done. When BBC Culture got together, they said that the most enduring narrative was the Odyssey. I don't know. It's kind of interesting how it goes with brothers. But we clearly see Odysseus is the singular hero. He has a group of people with him, his crewmates, but they all die off in the series. He's only left at the end. There's not really a bad guy in this series.
There's mostly nothing you can say that is a bad guy.
Yes, but there's a lot of overcoming struggle, being by yourself, that isolation tendency coming out really heavy. Nature of man, you can relate to Odysseus as that point Trump gets in effect. He's separated from his wife, so you have a love struggle incorporated into it. So it also follows elements of the romanticized genre, but with foreshadowing the hero's journey story structure onto Western civilization. Like guest friendship is a big thing. He has friends along the way. That is kind of what the group of friends archetype is based on. Testing the individual, the obstacles that come your way. The hesitation to learn others, the identity, the Olins that come along. So it's kind of interesting. So that's like the hero's journey with the Odyssey. And that's kind of how the hero's journey kind of plays into effect. You complete the quest. Typically, the villain gets established. He's one singular villain throughout the storyline.
Most of them have that be the case. Whether it's a rival, someone who made the hero go on their journey for whatever reason, oftentimes killing or harming a family member.
Yes, and the motivations of the individual are to the individual of the hero. So that's also a big play in that. So now we're going to go into Kishotenketsu, which is kind of interesting because it's 4 different parts. The key of Kishotenketsu, the key is the introduction. Show is the development. So Kisho is intro and development of the story. 10 is the twist or the complication. So Kisho 10 is that part you introduce, you have it develop, and you have a twist coming apart. And then the Ketsu is the conclusion or the reconciliation. So they reconcile, and that's how it all happens.
That fits several animes.
Yes. Kishotenketsu is actually pretty relevant in Western civilization. It's a 4-part story structure that's really easy to replicate. Now, it's just like the hero's journey, as oftentimes the hero's journey is replicated. Kishotenketsu is also replicated the same way. It's an easy story structure that the civilization has, as a collective, I would say the majority of it is follow that pattern in some form.
I would have said it was a starting blueprint or foundation to a story. You start out by writing the baselines, which would be the hero's journey or the Western equivalent of it, and then come up with the concept from there. So it's actually a good foundation if you're wanting to write a story.
Typically, with storytelling, there is that structure. And genre they write in, the archetypes, the tropes, stuff like that, character development, you can find archetypes and tropes all the time throughout different cultures, different stories. So that's how they relate. So that's how authors can get into the storytelling to give it structure. They don't have to follow a specific genre or story structure, but they typically take inspiration from organization in the story itself. And the example we're going to do with Kishotenketsu is actually Journey to the West, about Son Goku.
I recall that being popped up during the research development.
Yes. Whereas people might have an example from Asian media. Dragon Ball comes example of Son Goku itself telling the tale. It originates in China.
Wait, Dragon Ball comes from China?
Yeah. Well, it's inspired by Chinese Journey to the West.
Well, I did not know that.
Wait, I said Son Goku. Does that Son Goku not sound familiar?
Yes.
There you go. So, So it's kind of interesting with Chinese. Now, it was published in the 16th century to the Ming Dynasty, and the contributor is Wu Qing in regards to one of the classic Chinese novels, the most popular literary work in East Asia. So there's other stories, but the reason why Journey to the West resonates with so many people is just the power of it and the mainstream. So you could say the Odyssey and Journey to the West, the publication being in written record for a similar time for the stories to compare. And the option the most popular, and now it takes a different version, and also Riley's version, 1942, which is the abridged translation, which is Monkey. So we have a different version of it with a character named Monkey instead of Sandoku.
I wonder if that's where the tail came from.
Oh, really? So basically, the novel is a legendary pilgrimage of the Tang Dynasty in just monks, Exxon base, who traveled to the western regions, Central Asia, and India, to obtain the Buddha Sastra, which are sacred texts. They were turned out to many trials and much suffering. The monk is reported as Tang Bay in the novel. Kind of interesting because Son Woku, who is the Sandoku, we also have the Failing and the Zhao Ling Bing, all together with the Dragon Prince, who has sustained Bane Eden at White Forest. The group of pilgrims journey toward the enlightenment of the power and virtue of cooperation. So there is comrades in this storyline, but keep in mind, they're there for a common goal. They're not there to be solely friends like the Odyssey. They're not friends. They're just on a related journey, okay? That's typically how
a journey to accomplish.
Yeah. Asian civilization, typically, you don't have a group of friends trope, but you have people that band together for a common goal. So they're like a temporary truce. They fight together to achieve the end, and they separate their way.
My mind went straight to Digimon with the mention of... They all circle around the goggle-head protagonist for some reason. Well,
Journey to the West is strong roots in like Chinese folk religions, mythology of Chinese, Confucianism, Taoist, and Buddhist folklore. The Pantheon of the Taoist is mortal. Buddhists are still a heavy something of religions. Let's see. The historical context is based on the historical events of Zhang Zhe, a monk at Jinchi Temple. So that does explain that a little bit. And also storyteller versions of Exar's journey dating back as far as the Southern Song Dynasty, which include a monkey as the protagonist. And typically this representation of monkey is also in Sandoku, feeling like a god deity who is also mostly attributed to. The supernatural abilities by Wukong, some other characters are widely thought as magic powers of the time in Journey to the West writing, often translated in non-Chinese literature. So in some translations, it says it's magic powers. So the main difference between the Odyssey and Journey to the West is that there's more of a supernatural barrier. The Odyssey is more cut and dry, establishing an old plot of hero's journey without divine information. So maybe there's not as much supernatural, but there is, but it's like Greek gods and stuff. So they both deal with deity, but Journey to the West is a combination of different beliefs into the storyline, while most of the Odyssey is mostly Greek. You can see that culture is like one way in one, but the culture in the other is different.
I definitely see that.
What are some comparisons you see in Journey to the West and Odyssey?
Go with the fact that both of them pull from from stuff that was a myth and myths and legends and common folk tales at the time.
Yep.
I mean, there's no Cyclops in Journey to the West. I can even pop another example of how did the Eastern and the Western depict dragons again?
Typically, dragons for the East are the Chinese dragons, which is like a serpent that flies, that breathes fire. The West typically depicts dragons on top of gold in a mountain, typically a flying lizard with wings. So think in Eastern civilization, think like a snake, but that has like scales and feathers flying in the sky, while in Europe, in Western civilization, think of a lizard that has wings, like bat-like wings, or demons. And the dragon completely different.
after the dragon, the Asians treat dragons as sacred creatures to be worshipped, whereas Europe treats them as creatures to be feared. Yeah, slay the dragon, save the princess. Those kind of stories are in Europe.
And that's often the tale of that. Europe tends to follow a very streamlined story structure, while Eastern culture is more open to interpretation, because the introduction, the development of the twist, the complication, or the reconciliation has had different effects on how the story told in Kishotenketsu. While the hero's journey typically follows the same plot device over and over and over.
Rinse and repeat.
Yes. And typically, you have like the introduction, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the conclusion in Western civilization too. You have the introduction to the characters, what's going along the way, so you have the rising action. The climax is that big point of the story where everything turns, the narrative changes. Then you have the falling action from the response to the climax, and then the conclusion is what happens at the end after the falling actions, after the climax.
I remember hearing that in English class.
Typically, the climax in Kishotenketsu is the twist or the complication. But it's not really a climactic turning point for the story. It's just a complication that needs to be figured out for the conclusion to happen.
And thus, trying to figure it out would be the following action, and there you have. And once it's completed, then the conclusion hits.
Typically, the response to the complication. So there is not really events leading up to the complication. The complication is there once you introduce its element until the ending. That's a big difference. Is the climax in Western civilization is typically the focal point where the story changes, while the complication in Kishotenketsu is it just happens when it relates back to the complication up to the end. But they always refer us back to it, and the reconciliation happens because after the complication ended, they reconcile at the end. Right?
And that's how you do a baseline story, at least in the West.
True. And a big thing about the main difference between Eastern and Western civilization, Eastern civilization in the East typically use or against the collective, the collectiveness of story, while the West is the individuality of the character.
That makes sense.
So the means for the collective is that if you face the collective, then the antagonist is typically in either the institution, society, or the supernatural. That's typically what the enemy is in Eastern culture. Typically, it's in groups instead of just one person. Western civilization is one bad guy versus the hero, which is a good guy. Good versus hate.
But in the West, it is not that simple.
Yes, the East is a little bit more kind of putting like supernatural out there, institutionalized the bad guy or the antagonist. The antagonist is not a single person or entity, it's a collective of what the forces prepare.
Which would you rather watch? Would you rather watch something with one villain or one with a force being with an antagonistic force?
Yeah, pretty much. I like how collectivism stresses the importance of the community. Individualism is focused on the rights and the concerns of each person. Unity and selfishness are valued in collective cultures. Independence and personal identity is promoted in individualistic culture. So what actually happens is this. We have unity and selfishness, or patriotism as valued traits on one side, personal identity and independence on the other side. So it's kind of interesting seeing how that plays out and that difference.
Well, that does not mean that Eastern cartoons can get pretty close to Western stories.
True.
They can become pretty close in terms of how they write their stories, to the point that people question, did this come from Japan or not?
Yeah. But yeah, one example of that would probably be your example that you want to share.
Right, which would be the Avatar: The Last Airbender, the first series.
Yeah.
Not talking about Korra, the live-action movie, or the upcoming live-action show on Netflix.
Yeah, that is actually kind of interesting. So it's a Russian adaptation of media, but it focuses on Chinese tradition. So it actually focuses on the collective, but also individuality at the same time.
It's like a fusion of both stories.
Yeah, the Final Nation is the collective, but a single leader. So you can still pick out the bad guy and the good guy, but you can also say that the entire nation as itself is the aggressor and the antagonist.
Even in the early seasons, which even in early season 1, we had a primary antagonist in the form of Zuko. Although he was a antagonist that would soon become an ally by the 3rd season.
Yes, he returns, he fights with the hero, but in Asian civilization, that story structure is that sometimes the bad guy becomes in cahoots with the good guy.
So it's so it's pretty common in Japan, in Western culture, for a previous threat to be
Asian civilization.
Right. The enemy
typically Eastern civilization calls that path. Western, typically, they have the bad guy. They don't usually return unless they were a reoccurring bad guy. They always join the hero on the journey.
I think you'd call them the rival more than an antagonist.
True, and something that also happens as well. So there's different elements to collectivism and the individual. But now we're going to get to the characters.
Do I need to explain the characters in the show, or would you like to do the honors?
You just choose the characters in general, how the civilization works. So in the West, you have the leading character, the impossible mission. They build the will, they're intelligent, they complete a goal. While the East, these ones in the story, went to something like the benefit like a group to an idea, self-sacrifice, so they think she wins.
Makes sense, and why did I see Avatar for both of those examples when you listed?
The fusion aspect.
You have the main character. It's from Aang's point of view, technically. You could argue it's from the point of view of either Aang or one of his companions' point of view, depending on the episode. But the goal is same. It's trying to stop what seems to be an unstoppable war that's been going on for 100 years.
The leading character has to stop it, has to do an impossible mission to achieve it.
You want a 12-year-old to stop a 100+ year war?
He got away from the first place.
Give him 3 seasons, he'll get there.
He builds up the willpower to do it. He builds up the intelligence factor by able to fight, and they complete the goal. So that's the West leading character development. But here's what the East civilization of the character comes into play. They want to benefit like a group through their idea. So they get the group of companions in order to achieve the mission. And for order to defeat it, they need to learn all the elements. So they get all together to do that.
Which for Aang would mean having companions that know one of the other elements he needs to learn. He'll have Katara to learn waterbending. Sokka's the comedic relief, but he means good. We get Toph, who teaches him how to do earthbending, and then Zuko, finally, for firebending.
And also, to benefit the group, they are benefiting the liberation of one country's control over the entire world. So that's what they're fighting for, is the liberation. So they're fighting for the group to be access of that liberation. Self-sacrifice is at the end, and what are they willing to do in order to do the victory? Do I have to end the conflict in a way that's going to be disgraceful to me?
That's talked about during the final couple episodes of the series. Like this, the way that this should be resolved, the way that the world wants it to be resolved is to kill the Fire Lord. That's how it should be resolved. This goes against Aang's philosophy. He doesn't want to kill someone. He doesn't want to kill someone.
Yeah, after the internal struggle, he struggles with his higher power. With also doing anything to win. But however, being a pacifist by nature brings the question, what is the alternative if you're not willing to do the most direct way to deal with it? But it leaves people wondering, what is the alternative if you're not going to do this?
Or better, is there an alternative way to stop this conflict? Is there a way to peacefully resolve this conflict?
Yeah, so that's typically how the characters go in these stories.
They found one for Avatar the Last Airbender. They found one for Avatar. They found a peaceful way to resolve the conflict. And I must say, clever, Deus Ex Machina aside, but very clever. I didn't see that coming. It definitely
was not with a happy ending. It's It's like a resolution into weakness violation.
And even ends with a romantic kiss.
Yeah,
To top
that's it. He has to put all cost level plus the weakness violation altogether. It's kind of weird in a way. But now we have the villain. Villain in the West is greed and power. That's the main motivation. There is no singular villain. There's all a supernatural element to be anticipated, and sometimes they can confront nature. So the motivation of antagonists from the East was just them being there, just being who they are. Nature itself is enough people. While the West kind of rise up and bring the power aspect to that character, so it's mostly for an individual.
Trying to destroy the person individually in the West, I take it?
Kind of, yeah. But they come from greed and power. They're greedy or they want power to fit.
I definitely can see that comparison working out in terms of antagonists.
Or the fact they lose that back that stuff. The tyranny, overlord at the time, hundreds of years before.
They wanted to conquer all the land and also slaughter all the
greed and power. And over time, the antagonistic nature becomes, it's just by default, dealing with it so long that everyone else adapts the similar trait.
I'd say that works. I'd say that works very well. A lot of cartoons that come from either America or Europe tend to focus on that being the end goal with antagonists or villains. One that I love thinking about would be Koryoko's Xana. It wanted to escape the supercomputer to take over the world. Something like that.
Yeah. Well, so with that being said, what are some notes of Western to Western storytelling you want to take the audience? Eastern to Western?
I'd say it really does depend on the story. I don't really focus on how the story is told necessarily, as long as the conflict and the story can get me invested in. Though I have been recently found that more stories that are made in Asian or Japanese origin do tend to grab my attention faster than something in, say, America, Canada, or France. It's just something I've noticed.
Plus, the story itself is kind of interesting. I don't actually like most of the popular movies that we have, like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, are all following the hero's journey. And, Studio Ghibli with, like, Spirited Away, stuff like that, has also adapted. But Kishotenketsu is very relevant in the actual setup of the story in so many media and stories like it.
And we've
seen honesty being so pivotal to Western culture as a novelty item. With Eastern culture, we have Journeys to the West being a pivotal medium in Chinese traditions, being told in that way and actually highlighting a really good story to face other stories on.
Essentially, we found our formula. Now let's use it as the foundation so we can make our own story that's similar to it, but has our own characters, settings, plots, etc.
True, and that's often the case in this as well. So when you think about it, at the end of the day, what story structure would you choose to watch the media?
Eastern. It's more interesting.
Well, it's more open-ended. More things can happen. It's not necessarily a archetypal storyline like Hero's Journey that we've seen so much in the West. It's intimately peak most of the time.
Especially when you know nowadays that it's very difficult to find something that is solely one or the other, especially within Western cartoons. A lot of them have been taking elements from the Eastern foundation of most anime. So a lot of them are starting to take elements. The aforementioned Avatar, but you also have like you can have Code Lyoko, you could have Gravity Falls, a ton of cartoons that have inspired countless others had some kind of Eastern ideas put into them, or even borrowing elements from them.
Yeah, and there's also that cross simulation that we see a lot of times in storytelling. If one story structure keeps being colored in another culture, another storyline is going to take inspiration and make it their own. But that's just the the convention of storytelling. People find studies of other storytelling, incorporating their writing, and eventually sometimes that becomes an entirely new style in storytelling, but by them doing that.
And then that inspired another writer to make another version, to make an entirely new story, which creates an all new genre, then inspires another one, then another one, then another one, then another one. The chain continues.
Well, I still find that Hero's Journey is still so relevant in modern media. Even anime is starting to adapt some of the elements of it. But they already have some of those tropes. So, because the tropes or archetypes that anime follows is also similar to some tropes in Hero's Journey. So, there is some overlap there.
On both ends, it's not just Western taking inspiration from Eastern. It's going full circle.
True.
It's probably
what do you
made
think is a better story? Journey to the West or the Odyssey?
The Odyssey, because I've actually read that multiple times.
Alright. I actually kind of like the Journey to the West. Because it's a faction of multiple culture that I like, the multicultural aspect.
And don't get me wrong, I like that element of multicultural. It certainly does add a layer of interest and depth, and as someone who loves looking up myths and legends of other countries, it certainly would be my bread and butter as well.
It's so weird? You take on the role of Kishotenketsu as a story structure as your favorite storyline. I take on the role of Hero's Journey, but then we switch in what media of literature we covered in those topics. I like Journey to the West, you like the Odyssey. So you like the Odyssey, which inspires the Hero's Journey. I like the Journey to the West, which follows similar to the Kishotenketsu.
I love Byron sometimes.
Well, I might go on Odyssey, but Journey to the West is more impactful than me.
Could also be because I have experience with the Odyssey before. As mentioned, we had to read about it in high school. So I actually have read the Odyssey.
Biases might be applicable to both of us. But which biases that we have, we don't know yet.
We've been exposed to both kinds. Although I think I've seen more of the Western. I've seen more Western stories than Eastern.
Yeah, true.
That doesn't mean that I don't see how those are connected to Eastern storylines.
Yeah, so concluding statements about Asian studies, the Eastern to Western, Eastern versus Western storytelling is this. You can use it however you want. Keep in mind, whether you take inspiration from is totally yours, as you create with this personal liberty and not actually take from the actual property. And go at it how you feel at it, how you feel you should like the story. How about you?
Since we both it did not matter which foundation we preferred, with which one we enjoyed. I think it does matter more about which one you expose yourself to. If you expose yourself to more Western, then if you expose yourself to more Western, then that's fine. It's gonna be appealing to some people, and Eastern storytelling have people who write for it as well, and some people who choose to put together.
True. So with that being said, choose whatever storytelling you like as a medium, whether it's the literature, the shows you watch, or the books you read. Just know that when you have it, when you see it, you can have it and have both the cake and the frosting as well.
Once you see it, it cannot be unseen.
But so that concludes this episode of Asian Studies with Eastern versus Western storytelling. Where can they find you and all that good jazz?
They can find me on Twitter. It is Shapeshift16, uppercase the first S. And you can find me on Twitter. My tag name on there, it's actually Crystal Colden. Everything's lowercase.
Alrighty. Well, just for this episode, thank you for being here. And bye, guys.
This concludes another episode of MC Anime Podcast. MC Anime Podcast is available on podcast directories like Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. We also have our website at mcanimepodcast.com. If you want to directly support us, then follow Patreon blog MC Anime. Finally, if you want services for hire, then we're available on Fiverr for audio and video production, graphic design, idea consulting, and blog and article writing.